Okay. So there's some points that I want to make about what she just stated in that short definition of grief. Is that the first thing is that grief just does not deal with just the loss of someone that is dear to us through death or end of life issues. Grief is any type of loss, and it's important to state that. In that, even when we lose things that were once significant to us, but is no longer significant to us today, we still go through a grief process. And one of the best examples of this is when an individual gets divorced because of either, let's say, domestic violence reasons, or the couple just fell apart and no longer have those loving feelings for each other anymore. We find that even in those situations where love has been lost or it's been destroyed, individuals go through a loss and a grief process. In fact, when I worked with victims of domestic violence, we often went through these 5 stages of grief because a lot of times going through these is kind of what led them back into their domestic violence relationship. The other part of that definition that the doctor provided was that it did start out as a medical model, meaning that grief was pathologized. But what we have found since the development of these grief models is that grief is a universal thing. It is not an abnormality. It's not someone who is experiencing dysfunction. What we find is that the grief process is a natural human process where humans need to go through all of the emotions and all of the thought processes associated with that loss and what it means not to have that thing, whether it be a marriage, whether it be a child, whether it be a parent, whether it be a spouse who passed away, for example, what that means to those individuals, okay? And it's been generally accepted that there's about 5 stages of grief. And they've usually always been put in this order. But on the onset, I also want to say that these aren't necessarily go in this order. It doesn't necessarily, it usually ends with number 5, which is acceptance. But denial, anger, bargaining, and depression can all be mixed up. But the thing that we have found is that at some level, people have to process their denial. They have to process their anger. They have to go through the bargaining process of what if. And the depressive part, the mood component, all of these things tend to need to be experienced before a person can go on into acceptance, okay? And as we'll see, a culture and communities tend to try and help these processes out through the ceremonial ways we go through burials, the way we mourn within a cultural context. If we look at all of the mourning processes and all the traditional processes, religious, spiritual, cultural, you'll see that they all facilitate these 4 processes that people need to go through, okay? And so let's start with just giving each one of these a definition. This first one is denial, and that's refusing to believe a probable death will occur. You can help others face it by being available for them, talking instead of forcing them to talk about it. I think denial, probably the best example I can think of is when someone is diagnosed with a chronic illness, such as heart disease or cancer. They might not believe the diagnosis at first. They might go and seek a second or third opinion. They might seek out different explanations for the way they're feeling instead of it being the cancer or the heart disease. But even when we see things like what we're talking about with end of life issues and the passing of loved ones, is that sometimes we can go through denial in refusing to accept that that person is no longer here physically. A lot of times denial is brought through spiritual means by letting the person experience that individual through their memories or their spiritual ways. But getting through denial is coming to the acceptance that the individual is no longer physically here, but that doesn't mean they don't exist within our mind. And again, one of the things about all of these stages that we need to recognize is that it's important not to force people to talk about what they're going through, but instead being there available for them to talk. Because again, sometimes we might misinterpret what the person is going through. Maybe they're going through the depressive stage, but we're seeing it as the denial phase. But allowing the person, just being there and allowing the person to talk through things is an important point made right here. In stage 2, we see anger. Once the diagnosis is acceptance as true, so this is an idea of maybe getting a chronic illness, the loss of someone, one natural process to go through is anger. So in this example, once a diagnosis is accepted as true, anger and hostility of feelings like will follow. Okay, so being angry with God for not giving you better genes, for example, or not allowing you to see the individual before they passed away, for example. Being angry at the doctors and the family. A lot of people who are diagnosed with, especially in our modern times, with genetics and genetic science, a lot of people get angry at their parents for giving them those genetic predispositions. And the pointer in dealing with the anger aspect is trying not to take it personally. Okay. A lot of times a person who is going through bereavement or grief will focus their anger on objects unrelated to the loss. Okay. So for example, in a married relationship, the man, let's say the husband lost his best friend, okay, or a good friend, a coworker of some type. He might displace that anger on his spouse, but that anger has nothing to do with his spouse. It has to do with the anger of the loss. But the individual doesn't know what to do with that anger because they don't want to place it on the person that they lost, but they don't know what to do with it. So, and again, of course, in this, because of the hostility aspect, we have to keep ourselves physically safe, because there are people when they get angry who might be predisposed or learn that a way to take that anger out is through physical means. So we got to keep this in mind. But when dealing with someone who has lost and they're displacing that anger unnecessarily, it's really helpful to try and allow them to express themselves so they can move on through the grieving process. In a sense, allowing them to have those angry emotions without taking it as a personal attack on you. Okay. But again, this is a very difficult, this is a skill that takes practice, and no one likes to be the source of someone's anger. So it is difficult not to become defensive in these situations, but it is one of the ways that we can help someone get through that grief process. Indeed, when doing counseling and whatnot with, again, victims of domestic violence and stuff, it wasn't uncommon that I would just let a victim sit there and yell at me and be angry with me for a while and let them break that process down until they could calm themselves and really process what they were experiencing. Okay. Stage 3, and I sometimes I think this should be stage 1, because I see this quite a bit in the beginning phases. You know, denial and bargaining, I think, switch back and forth. We deny that it happened, but then we bargain for something else. Okay, so bargaining, a dying person may start to negotiate with God, for example. I'll live a healthier life if you'll just let me live a little bit longer. I'll be nicer. Maybe they say I was angry, so let me ask nicely to please let me live, those kind of things. They may negotiate a doctor by saying, how can I get more time so I can live in my dream home, and so on. And there's, in this stage, there's a deep sense of yearning at this stage. There's this deep sense of wanting to try and make some negotiation to make it so you can spend more time with that person or live a little bit longer or experience life a little bit longer. And if you think about this, this stage makes human sense because we spend pretty much all of our life bargaining, right? When we go to work, we're bargaining with our employer for work, for wages. When we're in a relationship, we're bargaining with our spouse to how we should live our lives together. And if you're a parent, you become a professional bargainer, right? Because we're always trying to negotiate with our children about way we should ask. So this one is kind of one of those human traits that we carry on through the grief process. And again, I say that denial and bargaining tend to flip back and forth because you go through the bargaining phase and you realize that's not going to happen. And then you go through a denial phase. And it's very easy to get stuck in that cycle between bargaining and denial. And one ways that we can help individuals with the bargaining is letting them go through that process, but disentangling when they're in a denial phase and a bargaining phase. And then stage 4 is depression. And this is when reality sets in. So bargaining, near death, bargaining turns into depression. And this is when we get the fear of the unknown and a guilt for demanding so much attention and depleting family income. Be available to listen instead of cheer them up, and rambling and repetitive talk. Oh, wait, I got to get to those in just a minute. I'll get to these tips in just a minute. If we think about the primary symptoms of depression, they tend to deal with hopelessness and helplessness. Hopelessness in that it's going to happen. It's there. We're going to experience it. And helplessness, the feeling that there's nothing else that can be done. There's no one there that can fix what's going to happen or bring that person back into our life. And for a lot of people, they feel a lot of guilt for demanding so much attention and resources that could have went towards the family who is going to be here after we pass, or guilt about how much time was spent with those individuals instead of living individuals, as an example. Now, one of the difficult things about working in the clinical field is disentangling depression as the natural grief process and depression as a clinical issue that needs to be addressed through medication and therapy. And probably one really good rule of thumb, it doesn't fit with everybody, but a good rule of thumb is if the depression hasn't depleted, hasn't ceased within 90 days, then it's really about time to consider that person, considering referring that person or encouraging that person to seek professional help, because the grief process may have triggered their genetic propensity towards a major depressive disorder. Okay. But normally when dealing with grief, about 95% of the depressive symptoms that we see abate themselves or disappear after about 90 days. Now, we do have to qualify that. It all really depends on whether the person has done the rest of the grief process, if they've gone through denial, if they've gone through bargaining, if they've gone through the others. Because sometimes the depression is also there because the person refuses to go through the grief process and feeling all of the emotions that are associated with that loss. And so we do have to recognize that depression can still, even long-term depression, can be a result of the person not going through the emotions of the grief process. So in this, some of the things that we can do to help people get through this is be available to listen instead of cheering them up or rambling or repetitive talk. So being a listener, and and this is a piece of advice that I think needs to be highlighted, is being available to listen instead of cheering the person up. And I want to just elaborate on that for a second. Is it becomes tempting to say things will get better. Let's go out. Everything's okay. You're healthy. You're here. Those type of things that we think rationally would make a person feel better. The problem is that those terms are in contradiction with how the person is feeling. They're in contradiction with what the person is going through at that moment, in that moment of depression. And so it can lead the person into even a deeper depressive mode than what you originally intended for the individual. But we do find that when we do just sit and listen and just hear the person go through the process and run it through their head, is a good thing. Now, instead of cheering up, if things are getting too melancholy or too down this in the depressive symptomology, one good technique is a distraction. Now, this isn't a cheer me up thing. This is a way of distracting the person from the current deep depressive symptoms that they're going through. So, maybe you distract them, as this says, about talking about sports, or saying, hey, did you see what was on the news the other day? Or just really quick, did you hear about so-and-so? And just to kind of get them out of their head for a minute. But then allowing them to go back in the situation. And I'll tell you why the distraction techniques are a good idea when you can see the person continuing in that depressive cycle, is that with depression, there is something called rumination. And the rumination cycle is what keeps depressive symptoms going. So, for example, if we think about people who are depressed, they often think, I'm a worthless person. And they show up to work and they go late, let's say, and they show up to work late. They go, see, here's evidence that I'm a worthless person. And they get stuck in that repetitive cycle, and they're unable to think of alternatives that prove themselves wrong about being worthless. Okay. And in the bereavement process, they can get stuck in that same depressive rumination about the loss and how they can't live without the individual, and how life is just coming to a complete stop and complete end. If you notice that kind of talk and it starts to become repetitive, that's when you could put in one of these distractions and go, oh, I understand what you're going through, but hey, I just wanted to ask, did you see that post on Facebook from so-and-so? Just wanted to know, sorry, it popped in my head and wanted to know if you saw that, and get them out of that rumination cycle. Okay. And then in stage 5 is acceptance. Okay. This is when we go through the first 4 stages. And this is, for example, when a dying have enough time and support, they can often move into acceptance. It's kind of comprised by this idea of an inner peace about the upcoming death. When we're dealing with people who have lost people, the acceptance comes into this notion that they realize that this is a part of life, and they get this inner peace that life is limited, and they come to this understanding that loss is acceptable, and that doesn't mean that they have to forget the person and what that person meant to them in their life, but they're able to accept that person is no longer here. When we go back to relationships, for example, we see that, for example, in bad divorces, where the couple is arguing, if they go through the grief process and they both come to this point of acceptance and this inner peace that relationship had its good points, and you remember the good points, and then you know why it ended the way it did, and you have this inner peace about it, that's when we see couples able to start to, for example, healthily co-parent together, or be able to work together for the benefit of the family they started when they were married, as an example. Okay. And so these are kind of the 5 stages. And I'm willing to bet if you look at your cultural traditions, the way you go through things ceremonially, you could probably pick out where these stages are meant to happen within that ceremonial process. Okay. So let me just summarize some of this stuff, and then we'll get to children in just a second. Just in summary, these stages don't always occur in order, and in fact, they can revert back and forth. For example, when I was talking about denial and bargaining, those often can switch back and forth from one to another for a while. Whether you're a patient or the loved one, nobody escapes grief. And this is an important point, okay? Grief is a natural human process. We all go through it. It's not something that can be ignored and taken away, okay? People's grieve at different rates of time. Okay, and I'm going to start with this first part. Grieving at different rates of time. Some people are able to grieve within one day. That doesn't make them heartless or cold. That's just their process. Some people grieve for years. I've known some people who grieve for decades before they get completely through the process. Okay. And there is no, for example, personality factor or emotionally sensitivity factor that determines the rate at which a person goes through the grief process. We also know that delayed grief can occur when people suppress the emotions of the death and years later get depressed. I've worked with individuals who lost, for example, a parent years ago, and then years later they go through a suicidal attempt. And in the end, it come to the realization is that they never went through the grief process from that loss of that loved one that they had. They completely ignored it. Maybe they masked it with drugs or alcohol. Maybe they became totally obsessed into their work and became workaholics. And then just at one moment, that grief eventually catches up to them, and it can hit them very hard. And so it's understand that there can be this concept of delayed grief. Okay. And again, I mentioned this in the beginning, there are cultural differences, age, gender, race, and personality changes the way people grieve. Okay. Culture really plays a huge role, our spirituality, our ceremonial processes. We do know that, gender does play a role because women are allowed to be very much more emotional, so they can go through the grief process in some ways easier. Not to say it's not difficult. Maybe easier is not a good word, but they're able to express it in a manner that helps them, where men have to hold those kind of feelings in. And personality changes the way people grieve. When we talk about personality, we're talking about not that the person won't grieve or how long they'll grieve. We talk about how they grieve. So we can look at, for example, introverts versus extroverts. Extroverts tend to need people to talk to. They're the ones that are going to call you up at 2 a.m. and need to talk. Introverts are more likely to isolate themselves and to bring themselves inward to try and process that information inside. The difference between both of them is eventually they need to express it in some way. Okay. Bereaved person have higher rates of depression and are greater risk for illness than non-bereaved people. So what this means is people who can't get through the bereaved process, okay, are at risk of higher rates of depression and greater risk of illness compared to those who went through the bereavement process and now are in the non-bereaved area of existence. Okay. So we have to understand that it's important to help individuals get through the grief process, because the longer they do sit in that bereaved process, the higher rates of things like depression. When we say illness, we're talking about coronary issues. Sometimes diabetes has been linked to bereavement and those types of things. All right, I am going to stop right here.